Hey everybody, welcome back. It's Reaper. The discussion question for this video is, what got you into comic book collecting? Now I mentioned what got me into comic book collecting a couple of times on this channel, but I figured I would go over it again here and for 2025 and do a bit of a revamp on it. But not only am I going to talk about what got me into comics, I'd like to hear what got you into comics in the comments. This video probably could have made a really good live stream video. I've often thought about doing a live video, but live stream on YouTube, obviously. But I never thought that. I don't know how many people would actually show up. I'd just be answering questions. So we'll see what happens. But anyway, let's get back to it. What got you into the hobby? Okay, I'll see if I could start with some of the basics. I've always been a collector of things. I think psychologically, all of us, for lack of a better term, have some type of addiction. Now, these addictions could be terrible, as you know. There's all sorts of addictions out there. You could fill in the blanks of which one they are that could be terrible. But I think we're all attracted to some things. And, a lot of times that, goes together with a hobby. There are people that collect sneakers, right? I didn't even know about that till several years ago, that there are people that collect sneakers. That's a hobby. Video games, as you can see. You can see I dabble in that a little bit. And of course, comic books. So I've always been a collector of things. When I was a kid, I used to, and I think a lot of people could identify with this. I used to collect action figures. I would go from one series to the next. Now, I didn't keep them on card like that type of collector. But I tried to collect as many as I could in a specific series. You could see sometimes in the back over here, well, most of the time in the back, you could see some type of figure display. You can see right back there, I have Thundercats. I have the Super 7 Thundercats. And I used to have a Thundercat carded collection too. I had all the rare ones. I sold them off about 10 years ago. But the one that I still have is right there, Hammerhand. Hammerhand, trying to do my finger. Hammerhand over here is like one of my favorite figures. One of my favorite Thundercat figures, one of my favorite figures of all time, and I have them carded over there. The card's not in the greatest shape. But, I've always liked collecting. Now, as I moved out of that, I got into gaming. So it was first action figures, then games. I used to try to get Nintendo games. As a matter of fact, I would try to collect Nintendo instruction manuals. Right? It's weird. I didn't even have the game to some of these. So I would talk to some friends who, couldn't care less about the instruction manuals. I'd get the instruction manuals and I would create a little collection of those. I had a nice little collection of Nintendo instruction manuals for games I'd never had or had never had any intention of getting, So I always had that desire to collect, and eventually I got into comics. So let's talk a little bit about, what actually got you into comics. But I wanted to provide you with a little bit of backstory on, collecting as a whole, collecting as a hobby. Well, I think we all have this desire to have certain things that you like, right? Some people collect watches, right? I recently, before I get back to it, I remember reading something about watch collectors, how watch collectors won't even, not all, but most watch collectors won't buy a watch unless it's, what do you call it? It's a type that I don't know too much about watches, so forgive me if I sound cryptic. Unless it's a type that you can tune, every day. Not the ones that just run on battery. I mean, I guess there's some level of battery in watches. I don't know. I'm not a watchmaker. I don't know too much about watches. But the collectors out there that want watches, they want the ones that, you have to tune every day to keep them ticking. That those are the more collectible ones. Well, whatever. Again, I don't know too much about it, but that's what I heard. Now, when it comes to comic books, I guess You know, I believe the first comic book I ever bought was it was not really a comic book. It was like kind of like the graphic novelization of the Batman 1989 movie. I went to go see Batman. I wasn't a comic book fan, but my classmates, this was at the end of the school year, they had these Topps Batman collector's cards. And they were bringing them in, they're showing them, and they're like, oh, there's this new movie coming out, Batman. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, oh, wow, this looks pretty cool. And that's how I got introduced to Batman and the Joker. And that's why I wanted to go see the movie a couple weeks later when it came out. And we all did. But when I was waiting to go see the movie, they had some merchandise in the concession stand. They had a couple of things. They had the Batman graphic novel, graphic comic of the movie, and I wound up getting it. And I remember flipping through it and saw the whole thing, how the movie ended and all that stuff. I didn't care about that sort of stuff. It's pretty cool. Yeah, I was looking at the Batman cards. I kind of knew what was going on in the movie anyway, so I knew that the Joker was going to get killed at the end, so it wasn't much of a, shocker. But that was my first comic book. But I never had a desire from that to collect other Batman comics or any other comics. It didn't come until maybe about a year later when Tales from the Crypt... Tales from the Crypt debuted, I think, the week after Batman came out in the movie theaters. I was a big fan of horror, so I watched Tales from the Crypt on HBO. They had originally, I think, they showed the first 3 episodes maybe for the pilot, and then they did another 3 as a test run to see how well it would do before they would do a second season. And I love that, but it wasn't until a year later now when Tales from the Crypt Season 2 came out, when they had a full set of episodes, not just 6. And just seeing how it was presented, like, these were comic books? Really? This seems interesting. And I really loved Tales from the Crypt. I tuned in every week. I was like, I want to go to the comic book store. We had a comic book store in the mall, not too far from where I lived. I want to see if they have some Tales from the Crypt comics. So I went there. The next time we went to the mall, I went to the comic book store. I said, do you have any Tales from the Crypt books? And they did. Of course, they were in reprint, and they had it was the Gladstone reprints. And the second comic book I would say I got, I believe, was Tales from the Crypt Gladstone reprint number 3, where it was a reprint of Tales from the Crypt 39. And another, those were double-sized issues. I forget. I think it was paired with a crime suspense stories. I don't remember. I'd have to look it up. But that was my second comic. So after that, I started getting Tales from the Crypt, and that's how I was introduced to Vault of Horror, Haunt of Fear, and shock suspense stories. So I would buy those reprints. So that was like my really first time collecting comics. But that's how I got into the hobby. And then eventually, again, we got to go back to collector's cards. Like the Batman collector's cards got me interested in seeing the Batman movie. And when I went to go see the Batman movie, I bought my first comic book. So it almost sets off like this chain reaction. Late 1992, the Marvel Masterpieces came out, those cards. Now, by that time, I knew of some Marvel characters. Of course, I knew of DC characters. I saw Superman and, obviously Batman, and Batman Returns came out that summer beforehand. So I was familiar with some of the superheroes as they started showing up on the big screen. More Batman the Animated Series just started. So I was interested in that. But Marvel cards came out, and I wasn't too familiar with all the Marvel characters. I knew of Spider-Man. I think I heard of Captain America. But all the other characters, for the most part, I never even heard of. I didn't know who the X-Men were. I know there was a video game, Wolverine, that came out that I purchased, and that's how I guess I sort of was introduced to the X-Men. But it was in 92 when I started collecting those Marvel Master Pieces cards that I really got familiar with the X-Men. And on the back of that card, for anybody that knows, they had a picture of the comic book where that character made his or her first cover appearance. There were some errors on the back of those cards, but it linked it right to the comic. And I said, maybe I could start collecting some of these. And that's how it started. And then I started collecting X-Men books. I think my first 2 X-Men books was they were X-Men 141 and 142, Days of Future Past, because the X-Men animated series just came on in January, and I started watching that. And around the time I got my first 2 comic books, superhero comic books, not Tales from the Crypt reprints or, the Batman one-shot a couple of years earlier, I went to X-Men and Days of Future Past. They did an adaptation of it in the first season of the X-Men animated series, and that was a great show. For those that watch, I still have to watch X-Men 97, and I know a lot of people liked X-Men 97. X-Men is one of the best comic book animation cartoons. I think it's right up there with Batman the Animated Series. I know Batman the Animated Series, when you talk to people, tends to be the gold standard when it comes to comic book animation, comic book character animation. Maybe. But if there's a second, and it's a close second, I would say it's the X-Men. I think that series was a no-brainer. X-Men, from what I remember at that time, was the #1 comic book in the world. I think a year earlier they released X-Men #1, the Chris Claremont, Jim Lee. It's right around the time when Image started, right? Not long after. X-Men were hot for a long time, so it made sense to create an animated series. I know they tried to do that in the 80s, Pride of the X-Men or whatever. I mean, I don't know where it went. I never saw it, but having all that, it was almost like a perfect storm. And then I started collecting. And that's when I became a comic book collector, superhero collector. And I started collecting X-Men, and I started dabbling in Spider-Man. And this all took time. But I believe on this channel many years ago, I did my history in comic book collecting. And a lot of what I just said was mentioned, perhaps maybe in more detail in that video. But that's what got me into comic book collecting. And ever since then, I've taken breaks, of course. It's evolved. I said, I'm going to only be an X-Men collector. Well, then I started getting Spider-Man. Then I started collecting Batman. Then I started collecting pre-code horror ECs. Then I started collecting Atlas. Then I started going into independence. So it was constantly evolving. Books that I wanted in my collection, books I got tired of having in my collection, and books I needed to upgrade in my collection. So that's what got me started in the hobby. So, I know that's a lot. It's a 12-minute, almost 13-minute mouthful. But I'm going to end the video, okay? And usually I like to make shorter videos. But if you could tell me in short, what got you into the hobby? What got you into comic book collecting? What was it that brought you in? Was it maybe one of the animated series? Was it actual just one day you picked up a comic? Was it some of your friends? Was it collector's cards? So many different things. Was it the action figures? I had those too, but I wouldn't say they got me into comics or anything. They were comic related. Maybe that was your introduction to comic books. Seeing, oh wow, the Batman figures are out, or oh look at these Marvel Legends figures are out. Let me do a little bit more. Let me do a little more research and look up the books. Be interested to know. Thank you, everybody. Take care.